Hello, everyone. My name is Kim Ciesinski, and this is the Dignified Divorce. I am a matrimonial attorney, and after a very long time of doing this, I have devoted my practice to keeping families out of the legal system. My practice consists of mediation, collaborative divorce, and negotiated settlements. I love having this podcast because I view it as an opportunity to educate people going through a divorce about more things than just the law. There's so much that touches a family when they're going through a divorce. And it's great to have the opportunity to bring people onto the show to get their take on how they could possibly help. So today I have a wonderful guest. Her name is Annie Levinson, and she is a certified child life specialist. Welcome, Annie.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
Sure.
So, Annie, before I met you, I had never heard of the industry or the designation certified child life specialist. And it sounds so fascinating to me, and it feels like it is just ripe with opportunity to help children going through a divorce. Because a divorce is one of the most stressful things that anyone can go through in life. It's right up there with the death of a loved one. And that's on adults. So we can all just imagine what it feels like to be a child and to be in that position and not have any understanding of what's going on in their world and between their parents. So I'd like to start with you telling us what your training is and your education, and then I'd like you to tell us what it is you do.
Sure. So certified child life specialists are psychosocial care providers. Typically and most traditionally, we are employed in pediatric healthcare facilities, whether that be children's hospitals, outpatient clinics that serve children, pediatric dentist offices, and more recently there's a push to bring child life out of the traditional healthcare environment to other areas, including hospice centers, funeral homes, even into other areas such as correctional facilities, to advocate for the needs of children. What a child life specialist is someone who advocates for, keeps in mind the developmental needs of children in the face of stressful experiences. So most traditionally, that's healthcare experiences, diagnoses, medical procedures, illness, injury, death. But, stressful events, like you said, don't stop there. They go into the legal system,
Yes.
other areas.
Yeah. So it sounds to me like what you do is you're focused on perhaps giving a child coping skills to deal with the stressful situation of their family changing, and perhaps to educate their parents on the developmental stages of their children and to best help them understand what they can do to help their children move through this. Mm-hmm. I think that's wonderful, and there's so much opportunity for that. I know that in the context of what I do, I very often, more often than not, will refer the couples who come to me to outside resources to help them through the whole process, because it's not just the legalities of the divorce. So much of your life is touched. Every aspect of your life is touched. And I find that, couples, they go through this process and they're so focused on what they need to do to get themselves through that sometimes, and certainly not intentional, sometimes a whole lot of thought isn't given to how is my child experiencing this? And I think that what you do lends itself to really bringing the child center focus and to help with some skills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, the needs of a child across the developmental stages are immensely different. And it's important to have someone who can look at a child, assess their coping, and let those in their life know, is this child coping in a positive way? What might clue me into the fact that this child is struggling? And how can we move forward? How can we go about fixing this, rectifying it, making a plan for how to make it easier?
Right. I just thought of something. What is the difference between you and a child psychologist?
Sure, yeah. So there's a lot of differences. The main one that comes to mind for me is the issue of diagnoses. A child life specialist cannot make diagnoses, whereas a child psychologist might look at a set of a child's behaviors and make a diagnosis, say, oh, that child is depressed, has depression. A child life specialist might look at a set of behaviors and think about that, think about the context of their development, and make suggestions to make those coping strategies a little bit easier.
Give us a concrete example. So let's say I'm working with a couple in mediation, and their child is really starting to exhibit signs of stress and having problems, and they're at a loss for how to really help their child, and they would like some resource. Excuse me. If I were to bring you in as an outside consultant to work with the family, what would that look like, and what would you do?
Sure. So depending on the age of the child and the, place in the divorce process that this family is it a new topic? Have they talked about it with the child? Or is it something that they're kind of still trying to keep out of the child's purview and their radar? Mm-hmm. I would have a conversation with the family to kind of get a sense of those things. And then from there, I might be able to assess whether or not I think some of my interventions could be helpful.
Let me just interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
You touched on, they try to keep their child out of it, which is very common advice. I tell people all the time, don't involve your child. But there's a point at which your child is kind of wandering around the house, feels all the negative energy, knowing something's going on and something is wrong, but they don't even know what's happening. Mm-hmm. I imagine at that point, assuming parents, you could probably be very helpful in explaining to parents, how do you sit your children down and tell them this is happening?
Right.
That's invaluable.
Yeah. And what we can do is give different strategies for that communication based on that child's developmental level. So for, let's say, a young school-age child, a 5 or a 6-year-old, we might encourage you to use the word divorce and to not use words that might try to mitigate some of the stress around it. Right. Separation, living apart, mm-hmm. not going to live together anymore. And though it might feel good,
like you're softening the blow.
Yes, mm-hmm. To use those euphemisms. Right. It's better to be concrete and use those concrete words because that child is at a stage in their development where they need concrete language. Mm-hmm. When we're advising families on how to speak with children around that age, 5, 6, 7, about death, we usually say use the D words, use death, dying, right. dead. Even though, your personal preference might be passed away, passed on, is in a better place, mm-hmm. it leaves room for misconception.
It does. Yeah. It does. And I find that there's so much room for misconception when the family is going through a divorce. And children tend to fill in the blanks with regard to what they aren't being told by their parents. And it's very common for children to blame themselves and to, take on the responsibility for what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. I think you offer such a valuable service of helping the parents understand what their child is going to understand most, how to present it to them, and then also helping the child. Mm-hmm. So I imagine that your skill set would be very, very helpful when it comes to the parents learning how to co-parent now. Mm. You're a nuclear family and then all of a sudden you're not, and you have to start co-parenting, and that's a difficult transition to make. Right. I would imagine with your input, you could be really, really helpful in coming up with a new structure for co-parenting going forward.
Yeah. I think what a certified child life specialist might do in those kinds of situations, they might talk to families about points of stress that they're experiencing. Maybe at the end of a weekend with one parent and the handoff to the other parent, maybe that transition is really difficult for a certain child. Mm-hmm. Or maybe dinner time for one parent is really hard and for another parent it's easy breezy. Right. What a certified child life specialist might do is make certain suggestions to the family on how to ease those specific experiences. Though we can't, pick apart a situation like a psychologist and, really try to get to the heart of why is this happening? Why dinner time?
Right.
Why my house? What we can do is actually look at the coping and think what can make this easier? What strategies can we utilize here to make this experience better for everybody?
That's wonderful. So it gets right to the crux of the issue and comes up with solutions rather than examining how you got there.
Yes.
Is that
and
correct?
I think most certified child life specialists, something that we're accustomed to is talking about what it is that we do and talking about the bounds of our practice and our scope and what it is we can and can't do. And I think that it's a really positive thing that we're able to kind of look at a situation and say, you know what, this is better suited for a therapist. This is not something that's really in my wheelhouse. It's something that I am constantly learning about how to do, and it's the thing I utilize my mentors for most. But yeah, it's a skill.
That's great. Thank you for making that difference very clear. So it's more behavioral than examining the causes of things. Yeah. That's great, which is more practical in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. You have a 7-year-old, okay, and he or she is having difficulty transitioning between mom's house and dad's house. Can you give us some examples of things you would do with that child to help him or her cope better?
Sure. I think that transitions are hard for children of a lot of different ages.
Hey, they're hard for adults.
Tell me about it. And I think that something that is really commonly used in other areas where transitions prove to be difficult for children, and I'm thinking school, certain areas, teachers will often say transitions between periods are more difficult than the periods themselves.
Sure.
Creating some kind of ritual around that certain transition. Let's say every time it's time to get in the car, a tantrum happens.
Right.
What can you do on the front end of that and on the back end to kind of make that entire experience a little easier? Maybe just before it's time to go in the car, you have one more snack, and it's a favorite snack, and it's one very specific snack. Or maybe there's one specific book or one specific game you can take 5 minutes to play to save yourself a lot of stress, because then getting in the car will be so much easier. And then on the back end, talking about, okay, well, after we go in the car, then we're going to do X, Y, Z, and kind of look for something to look forward to. Just add some of that tradition and repetition and predictability.
That makes sense. So you tie in the transition, which is troubling to the child. You connect it to a positive for the child and make that the role, the thing that happens every time, so that it gives them some sense of security. That's very good advice.
Yeah, a little positive reinforcement.
I know. Because I know sometimes I think, look, every parent loves their children. And I'm going to say we, because I'm a divorced parent also. We all do what we think is best to protect our children from what's happening and to make the transition for them as easy as possible. But we, including myself, sometimes overcompensate in trying to make the children feel better or not feel the change. I myself was guilty of the divorce puppy. So I really, and I do this for a living. I understand.
Yeah.
It's hard. You just want to make your baby feel better.
Yeah. And I think that it's the talking about it that's the hardest thing. And if there is a chance to kind of break through that discomfort and really ask the child, what do you need right now? That will not be the case for every child. Not every child will take a big sigh of relief and say, thank you so much for asking. I've been holding this in. We do have those kids who are a little bit more avoidant of the situation and don't necessarily want to talk about it. But to make the space for those feelings of discomfort, those feelings of frustration, confusion, not feeling, to make space for those things to come up as early as possible in the divorce process as early as possible in that transition is really